Hey friends, good to see you again. Kind of an odd thing to say since I don't actually see you. But anyway, today we're going to talk about outlining. And let me start with this very important point. I know I tend to repeat myself a lot, but it's because there's certain things I really want you to hear me on. Um, you got to outline. You got to outline your thesis. As I've said in many videos, I like to just sit down and write. That's kind of my style. So I'm just going to sit down and let the genius flow. I don't know, not genius, but yeah, I'm going to let the ideas flow, right? With this, because there are so many complex parts and it all has to connect, all these pieces have to come together, you really must outline. So I cannot advise enough or advocate enough for you to outline because having gone through this process myself, as I said, and then seen so many students go through this process, outlining is a gift from God. So what I would suggest is at this stage, if you haven't already, to start an outline. And what I want to do in this little video is actually walk you through the 5 chapters and what I would advise in terms of putting outlines together. Okay, so some of this might be just kind of a review or a moot point for some of you who've already outlined or done extensive writing. That's fine. Even if you've written like chapter 1 and 2, for example, I would still recommend outlining the whole thing because there's stuff that maybe you've written that you think, oh, it's not structured right, or it could be better structured. We'll talk about that. Okay. So to begin with, the first half, and I've got your paper kind of divided into 2 halves. 6324 is going to cover the first 3 chapters. 6199 will cover the last 2, excuse me. So it's a first half and a second half, but they all come together. So I'm going to talk about the first half first, and then of course follow up with that in a moment. So chapter 1. Chapter 1 is your introduction, and these are the official titled chapters. Chapter titles, there we are, for each one, so I would note these. And I would advise an outline, like we're talking here. You can actually even start to put one together as I'm speaking. But what I would suggest too is that you open a separate Word file or create a separate Word file for each of your 5 chapters, because that'll allow you to kind of make progress on any of them. It doesn't have to be done in a linear way. If you're anything like me, you like to start writing the introduction and then move on to the review when that's done, and so on and so forth. This writing is going to be kind of asynchronous. You might think, oh, I got a great idea. That goes in the methodology. And then you jump back over to chapter 1 and do some more writing there. So I would advise a different Word document for each of your 5 chapters so that you can organize your thoughts as you move through it. So let's start with the introduction. Okay, the introduction is going to basically cover what is the nature of the problem. Why even do research on this topic, right? I love to see the very first sentence of this chapter be a statistic, right? Your hook. The first sentence of this paper is going to be the hardest to write, as is the last sentence of this whole paper, right? So what I would suggest is use a viable reference. You know, every year, X% of Americans experience this. So, or worldwide, you know, X number of people will see this at least once in their lifetime. Whatever, right? Give me something that makes me think, wow, it's a good sized problem, or that's an important issue, or whatever. As the reader, I just need that hook, right? So you'll spend a lot of the introduction telling me the nature of the problem, why it's so important. Give me some background too. So for example, I've worked with students recently who are looking at racial inequities in the education system. Okay, absolutely, great topic. But give me the whole background. Tell me about educational segregation, separate but equal, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education, right? Tell me about these things. Give me the history to bring me up to speed on what's happening in contemporary inequities in education, right? That's what the introduction should do. If you've got terms, for example, if you're going to talk, when you talk about inequity, educational inequity, define it, right? You know what it means as the writer. The reader probably has an idea, but what you want to do is tell them, when I say this term, this is what I'm talking about, right? Even if it's down to something like discrimination. Everyone knows what discrimination means, but if you provide what's called an operational definition or a conceptual definition, depending on the nature, right? Now your reader knows, okay, every time I see them use this word, this is what they mean. Okay, so you can outline this in that fashion, right? So good stats, good history, and then definitions, right? So this is all a good way to start your introduction, and then closing it most likely with your research questions. Chapter 2, the lit review. This one is usually just an explosion. This is one where people are like, I'm just going to talk about research that's already been done, and it's kind of chaotic, right? What I would recommend is a lit review that starts with some kind of like a paragraph of general commentary, right? But then has 3 subtopical sections. So if educational inequity is your topic, for example, you might talk about segregation in your first subtopic. You might talk about employment inequities as your second subtopic. And then your third topic will move more specifically to educational inequities, right? And you could say these employment inequities can be traced back to educational inequities. And you make that transition from your second to third subtopic like this. Please, 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 3 subtopics. This will help you organize your research, and it helps you, it prevents you in many ways from saying, okay, this is research, this is, Jones and Jones, 2002 said blah, blah, and then just a paragraph about that. And then next paragraph, Smith and Jones said da, 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 right? We don't want to go research article by research article. We want to go subtopic by subtopic, and then you group these articles together depending on what subtopic they pertain to, okay? If you didn't do this in your lit review, you can go back and do it. Outline first, and then go back and restructure them. Doesn't mean you have to like delete chapter 2, but you can copy and paste, or rather cut and paste, and move things where they need to go so they follow a good subtopical flow. Methodology. Methodology has a natural progression of subsections, so it's going to include things like participants, instruments, procedure, stuff like this. And then you can even include like, analysis style, right? So are you using SPSS? Okay, great. What are you running? Right? So the methodology chapter already has designated subsections. And when you go to organize these two, I know it might seem redundant where you think, well, I could just write this stuff. Sure, of course you probably could. But when you outline, it's going to let you know exactly how you want your paper to flow. And if your outline is done well enough, by the way, your outline can actually transform over time into your paper, where you don't even have to like change documents. You can say, okay, well, I've already put so many sentences and everything like this. I'm just going to build it out, right? Think of the outline as like the bones. You need the bones to hold the whole body up, right? That's where this comes in. And during this course, we're going to really make sure that this is rock solid here. This is where we really want to spend a lot of our time in 6324. I want to transition in just a moment to talk about what we'll do in 6199 so that we can see the continuity. So even though we're not at this point yet, I would love to see you outline for 6199, because now it's going to make sure that your first half and your second half of your paper match up, and that you are really well prepared to go into 6199 and just continue to write in a very continuous manner. So the second half of your paper is going to include chapter 4, which are the results, and chapter 5, which is the discussion. Okay? Chapter 4 is going to vary wildly depending on your topic, your methodology, all sorts of things, right? So if you're doing a qual study, qualitative, it's going to look very different than if you were doing a quant study. Even down to what kind of statistics you might provide, that can vary the results section quite a bit. This chapter, though, is going to be fairly minimal, right? And I would organize it, for example, like this. So you got the results chapter. I would give a subsection, an early subsection about just demographics, right? And descriptive statistics. And then I would give subsections for each of my hypotheses, right? So hypothesis 1, subsection, hypothesis 2, subsection, hypothesis 3, and so on, right? And within each of those, I would do the analysis. I would say, okay, well, hypothesis 1 addressed this, so I ran a correlation, blah, 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 blah. Hypothesis 2 was looking at this, I ran a t-test, yada, 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 so on and so forth. And then when you get to the end of the results, just kind of conclude anything in there. Or not conclude, excuse me, just wrap up the chapter. Because chapter 4 is not about interpretation, it's simply about objective analysis, right? So don't say, oh, these stats mean, no, that goes in chapter 5, okay? Chapter 5 should start with the same kind of organization as chapter 4. General discussion, hypothesis 1, 2, and 3, but now you're actually saying this is what the stats mean. This is what you need to know about your hypothesis. So in hypothesis 1, you might talk about it a little bit and say the data indicates that we should reject hypothesis 1 or fail to reject hypothesis 1, whatever the data seems to indicate. But this is where you're giving more interpretation and you're telling the audience what they need to think about those hypotheses, not what they need to know, but what they now need to think, right? So what they need to know goes in chapter 4. What they need to think goes in chapter 5, right? Once you break down each of your hypotheses that way, you're going to have subsections for limitations. You'll have a subsection for implications. And your final subsection of your entire paper will be future research. So you're saying, okay, this is what could have been done better in the study. This is how the research is applicable to the real world. Give good examples. There's another lecture on that. Right? And then this is what future studies could do. And you're not going to say something trite and simple like future research is needed or further research is needed. Yes, of course. right? Research is like money. There could always be more of it, right? But what future research is needed based on what you've done? Where do we go next, right? And if you think of this kind of like a timeline, when you're outlining this, you're saying, okay, this is what they've done in the past, this is what I'm doing now, this is how it could have gone better, this is what I discovered, and this is what they can do in the future. So you're moving chronologically in some sense, right? Past research, current study, future research, right? So as we outline this, as you go through this, a more detailed, explicit, complex outline will really save you a tremendous amount of time when it comes to the writing process and kind of keep your thoughts organized as you move through, because it's real easy to get kind of discombobulated and think, well, did I mention that in chapter 2, or does that go more in chapter 5? Where did I write it before? Like so. You've got this all laid out. And so as I said, as I started this with, please make sure you take even just a few minutes to start to outline your work. Even if you've already gotten through a substantial amount of the writing, outline those chapters first and continue to do a full 5-chapter outline. This will help you with the continuity of your writing, and when you go to sit down to address any new chapters, including chapters 4 and 5, you've already got a foundation on which you can build an excellent thesis.